I'm Veron. I work for MVNX. I've been in the industry now for about 10 years. Initially started with an MVNO that MVNX used to support, and then joined MVNX a few years ago. But I've been leading some of the commercial activities and business development activities for MVNX. And I think I've really been at the heart of the growth of the business. I think where we are today from an MVNO industry perspective, there's definitely an incredible sort of opportunity for a lot of MVNOs, and I think we're at the center of it. We've been one of the pioneering MVNEs in the country. We've been lucky enough to get consulting opportunities outside and across the border, and I think that's definitely where our focus is as a business. I think from a business perspective, we've really evolved our proposition. We initially started being very heavy on the telco side in terms of technology platform. We've evolved our technology platform as well as our service offering. We've really opened up our platform beyond telco, and I think that's another theme that's really come across during the conference, and they're helping us really build a very rich ecosystem around it. And that technology has been one of the enablers, but I think we've really leveraged the heavy weight of our group services, and that's probably makes us probably one of the more versatile enablers in the market. It's really a great platform for MVNOs and MNOs and the industry at large. I think it's probably the event on the continent, really bringing together the industry experts. And I think, if you're aspiring MVNO, this is probably the event that you want to be at. I think there was definitely, a distinct flavor this year. A lot of it around ecosystem, partnerships, how do you win? I think that's probably one of the key themes that have come across. I think, the event's always well put together. I've been here for the last 3 years, and it's better and better every year. So thanks to the team for putting together such an incredible agenda. I think that a lot's been said, and I think, with a room full of industry experts, I think there's very little room for things not to be said. But I think, probably one of the areas that I feel that's probably hasn't been covered well enough is the how and the why. And I know it sounds very basic, but, I think, a lot of MVNOs have tried to get into market, but haven't really pinned that how and why. And I think that's probably, as MVNX as well, that's probably where, we take a lot of pride and spend a lot of time in unpacking that with the client. So, we've seen MVNOs present, some with some really deep stories, like the guys at Yomo presented a very deep, deep proposition. But I personally didn't really get the why and the how. And, luckily they've partnered with us through this journey, and that's something we're going to help them unpack. But I think that's probably been one of the areas for me in looking at the presentations that have been delivered, is really getting to the depth of that how and the why. And I think if we can get to the depth and the understanding of what the why and the how is, I think the rest is actually easier. Outside of the technology and the operational excellence and the partnerships, I think if you can define what that is, I think you've found the winning formula. I think the key takeaways for me is there's definitely a theme around ecosystem partnerships and how MVNOs win. I think that's come across through a lot of the delivery, whether you were in MNO. So that really came through from the guys at Vodacom, in terms of them really getting becoming a bit more participative in the space. And I think with a lot of the MVNOs and MVNEs, I think that's been the narrative that's coming through. And I think, why that narrative is being driven is I think there's an acknowledgement that there's a lot of MVNOs that launch, but then, fail. And I think that's really coming through in the narrative and the content coming through this year. And I think those are probably the 3 things that I could pinpoint as key takeaways. And, if you're an aspiring MVNO, I think that's probably where you'd want to focus your efforts on. It's getting the right ecosystem, the right partner. And those are going to be, the 2 sort of secret ingredients that are going to help you win. Yeah, listen, I think, the only advice, and it's really basic advice. I think if you can really pinpoint the why and the how, I think that's really the critical questions, and really unpacking what that means. And that's where I would start. The critical thing for any aspiring MVNO is really to answer the why and the how. The why really resonates around, well, why do you want to do this? What is your target segment? Why would they want your CVP? All right. I think if you can tick that box, then the next question is the how. How are you going to get this, executed? How do you build an acquisition strategy around it? How are you going to define what your distribution channels are. So I think those are some of the really basic questions, but really critical questions at a very early stage of even considering building an MVNO. And I think if you can answer the why and the how effectively and really tick those boxes off, I think you've already got 50% of the formula to win.